I'm extremely honored to be here. I'm delighted to be in Armenia for the first time. I'll be back. And I've already learned a lot this morning in the sessions that I was able to go to. When you have all these parallel sessions, you can't go to all of them, but I sat at the back of the room in one room and listened to a number of very interesting talks, diverse and interesting talks. I want to thank both Paul for putting this to me and Maria for organizing everything, Maria Armenian. I'm very grateful to you both and to the university for being the physical host of our presence here. And I'm looking forward, of course, to other talks as we go ahead. Aristotle thought of citizens of a state as a group of people who knew one another. As he says in the Politics, in order to decide questions of justice and in order to distribute the offices according to merit, it is necessary for the citizens to know each other's personal characters. That was why his ideal polis had to be so small. But the economic and technological needs of modern life in a world of billions require forms of coordination that inevitably involve millions of people. So many of the distinctive advantages of modernity derive from the rewards of scale. Even the typical modern city is a community of people who literally could not all know one another. The OECD defines even a small urban area as having a population of 50 to 200,000 people. Well, imagine trying to make even a mere 50,000 people learn each other's characters. And so, unlike Aristotle's polis, every modern democratic state is a community of strangers. In many earlier forms of statehood, subjects were defined by vertical relations. Ashantis or Chinese or Englishmen or Frenchmen or Persians were distinguished by their shared subjection to a ruler who often had a religion that endorsed his or her dominion. But in a modern democracy, the citizens conceive of themselves, at least ideally, as a people who are governing the state together. They're characterized in part by their horizontal relations with one another. Since the French Revolution, at least, people in the North Atlantic have spoken of fellow citizens through the language of fraternity. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. Like all metaphors, this one is potentially misleading. In this case, because literal brotherhood typically entails forms of intimacy. Still, there is some value in the figure of brotherhood and sisterhood because it implies a certain equality and a certain mutual concern. And that mutual concern is central to the life of democracy. I pay taxes to a federal government that spends the money in every state of the American Union. My money goes into a fund that pays for roads in Alabama, medical care in Mississippi, scientific research in California. My New York taxes pay for social services for the children of people I will never know. That I am more than comfortable with this, that I am happy to think of these expenditures as benefiting people I do not know, is in part the result of the fact that I conceive of the beneficiaries as my figurative brothers and sisters, my fellow Americans, my fellow New Yorkers. The achievements of modern democratic societies, the systems of healthcare and social security, for example, that are part of the practice of even the poorest democratic country, depend on such sentiments. And so, as I say, when things go well, most of the individuals and the families and the face-to-face communities in the territory under one system of political rule, however diverse they may be in other ways, nevertheless constitute a single people. And I want to think with you today about how to understand that fact. There are many ways in which the democratic idea can be implemented, some, no doubt, better than others, but all of them require some sense of solidarity, some sense of a we. And the standard way of achieving this is through the articulation of a shared national identity. It's a natural thought that if large groups of human beings have already begun to think of themselves as a we, thinking of themselves already, as we might say, as a people, then that identity can be put to use in providing that necessary solidarity for a state that doesn't yet exist. One explanation, then, for the existence of the sense of ourselves as a self-governing people is that we were already, or our ancestors, we were already a people, and the modern democratic state merely gives political form to an existing identity. Much European philosophical theorizing about that national we, that identification as one people, draws on ideas developed among thinkers writing in German at the turn of the 19th century. Theorists who had just that thought that there was a people waiting for a state. Johann Gottfried Herder, who was mentioned in one of the sessions that I was in this morning, in the later 18th century, inspired both by Enlightenment and by Romanticism, famously thought that the Germans were united not just by a language, but by a spirit, a Geist, embodied and embedded somehow in that language, in what came to be called a Sprachgeist, the spirit of the language. Herder thought that a folk, a people, was defined by such a shared spirit, and though he does not, I believe, use the actual word, the idea of the Volksgeist, a national spirit, an idea more explicitly articulated in Hegel, is often and plausibly traced back to some of Herder's writings. But the great work of developing a national spirit, the spirit of a people, was centrally cultural for Herder. It was not about gathering the scattered German-speaking men and women from their more than 100 states into a single nation state. Using the word people to translate Herder's word folk allows an English speaker to hear the sense that the national spirit was to be found in the cultural life of the common folk, of the people, of ordinary people, not just, as they also thought, in the great intellectual achievements of the literary language of the Luther Bible or of Hölderlin and Goethe and the figures who we think of as making modern German literature. The collection of German folklore by the brothers Grimm, the fairy tales now told to children all around the world, I heard Grimm's fairy tales growing up in Ghana, was, like the brothers Grimm creation of the first German dictionary, the Deutsches Wörterbuch, a contribution to the development and the celebration of the intellectual and moral life that they thought the German people, speakers of German, shared. So the work of curating the German Geist could be done by Germans, as they understood it, as Herder understood it, wherever they lived and whoever ruled them. When another JG, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, a few years after Herder's death, speaking in Berlin, which at that point was occupied by a triumphant Napoleon, made his famous 14 speeches to the German nation, Reden an die Deutsche Nation, in the winter of 1807 and 8, that nation was still spread over scores of states. Just a few years earlier, in 1803, nearly 50 self-governing cities and nearly 70 ecclesiastical states ruled by bishops and abbots and priors of the Holy Roman Empire had been absorbed into secular states. And later, a little bit after these Reden, in 1815 at the Congress of Vienna, once Napoleon had been vanquished, European diplomats tried to clean up the mess left by the Holy Roman Empire, which had collapsed in 1806, by creating a German confederation of 39 predominantly German-speaking states with a Bundesversammlung, a federal gathering, a federal convention in Frankfurt, which governed by a rule of unanimity, but without a head of state. So the Bundesversammlung had no head of state because it was a Versammlung, it was a collection of states. This collection of kingdoms, principalities, duchies and grand duchies, with some familiar names to us like Prussia and Bavaria, and some much less familiar like Mecklenburg-Strelitz. We remember Schleswig-Holstein, but at that point it was called Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Beck, because the ruler had titles from 4 places, was itself to be dissolved. All that, the German Federation, was dissolved in 1866 and replaced by a Prussian-led North German Confederation, which left largely German-speaking Austria and some southern German states outside it. So as the New York Times wrote in July 1866, there is in political geography no Germany proper to speak of. There are kingdoms and duchies and grand duchies and principalities inhabited by Germans, and each separately ruled by an independent sovereign with all the machinery of state. Despite the messiness of these political arrangements, which had to do with states, Fichte said confidently about the German nation that he was addressing, "I see this unity as already arisen completely and standing there presently." So whatever Fichte meant by the Deutsche Nation, it was not for him the reflection of a political entity, of a state. The extent of Fichte's German nation is wider than most modern readers, I suspect, would anticipate. He says in passing, for example, that while the true Germans were distinct from the many ancient German tribes, the Scandinavians are here undoubtedly taken to be Germans. So what we call Danish and Swedish and Norwegian must have been, for Fichte, forms of German, however hard that would have been for other Germans to understand. Fichte didn't just know that his Germans were spread over lots of political units. He wasn't especially interested in bringing the German nations into a single state, German nation into a single state. So what we call Germany began to take something like its modern form, I suppose, in 1871, after the Prussian defeat of the French Second Empire, when the southern German states, excluding Austria, joined the German Empire, whose leading force was Prussia, under the guidance, famously, of Bismarck. Obviously, though, the modern German state, as we now think of it, is the product of the Wiedervereinigung of 1990. But in 1808, Fichte's main concern about states was that the Germans should not be drawn into what he called a universal monarchy. Finally, there to see in all its hatefulness and irrationality the dream image of a universal monarchy, he wrote. And what he seems to have had in mind here was the domination of Europe by a single ruler like Napoleon. He was not even contemplating the unification of Germany under a Kaiser. That wasn't even one of the... He didn't even bother to rule that out, let alone to propose it. So instead of a picture of the Germans being drawn into a single state, Fichte draws an explicit analogy with the world of classical Greece, which of course, like educated Germans of the time, he knew a lot about, which was never united into a single state, but nevertheless conceived of as a single people. Here's what he says about that. As was the case only with the Greeks in ancient times, among them the state and the nation were separated from each other, the former in the particular German kingdoms and principalities, the latter visible in the imperial union, the Holy Roman Empire, valid not by virtue of a written law, but by a law living in everyone's mind, not Geist, mind. And its consequences everywhere visible in a multitude of customs and institutions. As far as the German language reached, the German tongue reached, everyone could consider himself a dual citizen, partly of his native state, to whose care he was first commended, and partly of the entire common fatherland of the German nation. The important thing for him was that individual Germans and the various German states all should understand that they were part of the German nation, that there was, whatever the details of political arrangements, what he calls a German fatherland. As he insists in the 9th lecture, the supreme authority in each German state had to be and should be guided by patriotic love, Vaterlandsliebe, love of the fatherland, for the whole people of the German nation. Now, later German thinkers and leaders did not, as we well know, follow him in his indifference to German political unification. But they did share his sense that the German Nation, the German people, as we would naturally say in English, was already there, waiting to be united and led. Indeed, Fichte thought that only the Germans really had a people, a folk, and that they were entitled to rely on, and only the German was capable of what he called proper and rational love for its nation. So at the heart of Fichte's understanding of what made the Germans German was a philosophy of language for the purpose of describing the peculiarity of the Germans. He wrote, "The fundamental difference between them and the other people of Germanic origin has been stated. The former have remained in the uninterrupted flow of a language developing from real life, while the latter have adopted a language foreign to them, which has been deadened under their influence." And so, in the 12th lecture, he declares, "It is undoubtedly true that everywhere a particular language is found, there also exists a particular nation which has the right to manage its own affairs independently and to govern itself." Remember, this is a man who thinks that the Scandinavians are Germans. So you might wonder what makes something a particular language, eine besondere Sprache. But the details of Fichte's notion of what it was that tied the German nation to the German language are peculiar enough that deeper exploration would take us a little bit out of our way. So I'm going to move away from Fichte now, but just take this key takeaway from his picture, which did come to be dominant in European thinking about the relations between peoples and nations, which was a sense that there was a natural unity of human beings that came from living together over long ages with a common language. And he explicitly suggests that we could call those who are under the same external influence on their what he calls their language apparatus, who live together and who continue to develop their language in continuous communication, that we should call that a folk, a people. So language is central to his notion of what's a people. Now, Fichte's story, I think, says too little, at least in my view, about the role of states in creating national identities, that sense of a we, the people, which seems essential to democratic self-government. If a people is to develop a common language on the scale of a modern country, one of those communities of strangers that are inevitable in the modern world, it will have to be because someone helps shape a national language, presumably someone plural, bringing the natural variability of dialects into a common form in order to create some vision of the language that can be used in the law and state institutions, which increasingly through the 19th century in Europe, those state institutions come to include the school, and universal education grows through the 19th century with the growth of the state apparatuses. I'm talking about Europe. Fichte anticipates this, since a large part of the later lectures are devoted to the needs of a German educational system, German national education. Though again, he's assuming that this will be done by many different states, but he thinks they should all be doing the same thing, roughly the form of education recommended by Pestalozzi. So there's a lot about the details of education in the later part of the addresses to the German nation. So I want to argue then that Fichte's picture, which has held sway in many conversations since his day, is a bit misleading. And in order to say why, let me offer two ideal types of processes by which contemporary states have come to develop a form of national unity. One comes from the gradual creation of more united peoples over the course of the 19th century in Europe, in states like England, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain. These stories, of course, have interesting variations. England, for example, around the time Fichte was speaking, develops a stronger sense of national identity during the wars with Napoleon. That's when Britain started singing Rule Britannia, even though Rule Britannia was written in the 1740s. It's really around in the Napoleonic Wars the Britons wander around singing Rule Britannia and thinking of themselves as British. Still, in all these countries, there are many languages in 1800 and many mutually unintelligible dialects of the dominant language. The modern French spoken on the radio is one dialect of the Languedoc, but it lives alongside other dialects and with the Languedoc even today. As Eric Hobsbawm pointed out long ago, at the time of the Revolution, in the name of the people of France in 1789, 50% of Frenchmen didn't speak French at all. Only 12 to 13% spoke it so-called correctly. And indeed, outside a central region, it wasn't usually habitually spoken, even in the areas of what he calls the Languedoc, which I was calling the Languedoc, except in towns, and then not always in their suburbs. In northern and southern France, virtually nobody spoke French. Eugen Weber, the Romanian-born, British-educated American historian of Europe, taught a generation of students of French history that as late as 1893, roughly a quarter of the 30 million then citizens of metropolitan France did not understand, had not mastered the French language. That their heirs now do almost all understand something called official French, which has been guided by a state institution, the Académie Française, since its creation under Cardinal Richelieu, which was 4 centuries ago. But this process has only really succeeded in the 20th century, and that's the result of the development in the 19th century of a national education system and its growth over the 20th. So now everybody in France who can read and write one version of French. They don't necessarily talk it, but they can, because they may speak something else at home. France isn't in this way peculiar. Just the other day, a colleague of mine, whose native dialect of German is Swabian, explained to me that many speakers of High German find it difficult to understand him when he speaks to them, so he has to shift into Hochdeutsch from Schwäbisch. But a modern education system guarantees that every German citizen who reads and writes can do so in a single form of the language. There's a form of German that's the form that is used by the state and it's used by its citizens, and if they can read and write, they can read and write in that. In Italy, the version of the language taught in schools and printed in most newspapers is sometimes called lingua toscana in bocca romana, the Tuscan tongue in a Roman mouth. But there are lots of places where people speak a form of Italian that neither Romans nor Tuscans can understand. And more than half the population of Alto Adige speaks German at home. Alto Adige is part of Italy. And Ladin has native speakers in many communities in the Italian Dolomites and elsewhere. Spaniards, the citizens of Spain, the state, include people whose first language is Basque and Catalan and Galician, as well as what we call Spanish, which of course also has many dialects. In all these cases, to the extent that there is a national dialect that is widely understood, that is the result of strenuous effort on the part of those states as national education systems grew starting in the 19th century. There have been other important forces in the shaping of national we's. Hobsbawm mentions conscription, which began in France under Napoleon, but was found in much of Europe in the 20th century, especially during 2 world wars, which took people from all over the country into an institution, the army or the navy, the air force eventually, that made them live side by side with people from other parts of the country. And that's another bringing together force in many European nation states. Another slightly different story is the development of the American identity in the context of the 13 colonies that sought their independence from the British Crown now a quarter of a millennium ago. Well, next year, a quarter of a millennium ago. When Jean-Hector Saint-Jean de Crèvecoeur wrote his letters from an American farmer in 1782, he spoke of individuals of all nations melted into a new race of men, the American. And that new race turned out, for a while, as his description of an American as, quote, an European or the descendant of an European, anticipated, not to include people who couldn't be assimilated as white. But a brief consideration of just one of the colonies, let's take New York, where I live, should remind you what was in reality a great diversity of origins, even for the Europeans. The first European accounts of that area come from Giovanni de Verrazzano. There's a Verrazzano Bridge in New York named after him, who sailed into the Hudson in 1524 and named the area Nouvelle-Angoulême in honor of his patron, François Ier, the King of France, who had originally been the Count of Angoulême, that's why it's called Nouveau Angoulême. The Dutch, ignoring this French grandiosity, named their trading post Nieuw-Amsterdam, declaring it the capital of a Dutch province of Nieuw-Nederland, and a year later, just a year after that, so they're displaying their own grandiosity in that. And pretty soon their settlement included not only citizens of the Dutch Republic, but also French, German, and Scandinavian men and women, some Jews who had come from Brazil, and some African enslaved people who could not be conceived of as European, presumably. Already then, nearly 400 years ago, the island of Manhattan, where I live, had people from Africa, Europe, and Latin America alongside indigenous Lenape people, and some of them practiced the Jewish religion, and a few were heirs to the earlier religious traditions of Africa and the Americas, but many of them were of a diversity of Christian sects. And after Charles II, the English king sent a force to seize the colony in 1664. He gave it to his brother, the Duke of York. This is the sort of thing European monarchs did in those days. They just handed things over to their relatives. And that's why it's called New York. Dutch settlers were permitted to stay, however, and continue trading. And soon more people arrived from the British Isles, from Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America. So in all these cases, if there is a modern people, the English, the French, the Spanish, the Italians, the Americans, a great deal of what they have in common, including in the way of language, is the result of over a century and sometimes longer of state activity designed to create a nation. It's not based on an existing Fichtian nation with a common language that was already there, waiting to be made the basis of a state. I tell my students often that when I first arrived at Cambridge as an undergraduate, as a medical student, there was another medical student on my corridor across the street who was a Geordie. He came from Newcastle. And I couldn't understand anything he said for the first week because he spoke a dialect of English with which I was unfamiliar. He understood me because I sounded like the radio. My second model case is the development of post-colonial nationalisms among the subject peoples of Eurasian empires over the later 20th century. This is a different story. Much of the shape of modern nationalism outside Europe is a response to political processes that occurred as the British, Dutch, French, Ottoman, Portuguese, Spanish, and Russian or Soviet empires collapsed over the course of the 20th century. It helps in thinking about such cases to have concrete examples before you. I grew up in Ghana, which is one of the places this happened, so let me tell you some stories from there. We can return to generalities at the end. I'm 3 years older than Ghana, and my father took part in the movements that brought us our independence. He represented Kwame Nkrumah, our first president in England in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, speaking out against British imperialism every Sunday at Hyde Park Corner in London, and helping to organize the 1945 Pan-African Congress in Manchester, which was one of the places where the anti-colonial movements of Africa and Asia, and with some guests from other parts of the British Empire, got together to organize their resistance and to think about what it was going to be independent Africa after the war. So my father's nationalism, like many 20th century nationalisms around the world, developed in reaction to an empire. And he shared it with many people who had not much except their resistance to empire in common. My earliest memories of my father are as a parliamentarian working in the post-independence legislature, deeply committed as a lawyer as well as a politician to constitutional government. And make no mistake about it, my father loved this new country of Ghana. His autobiography, I will show you the cover, was called The Autobiography of an African Patriot. And though he cherished Africa, which was for him as a Pan-Africanist, his patria in some sense as well, so my father felt about Africa what Fichte felt about the Germans. It wasn't my state, but it was something important to me, and I should think of myself as being framed by my African identity. At his heart was a commitment to self-government with a constitution that gave us rights and made us equal under law. That brotherhood thing. And my father, because he had a British colonial education, knew that Aristotle had identified the form of the polis with its constitution. And so he knew constitutional patriotism was an ancient idea. In my teens, after a period as a political prisoner, my father specialized in taking the government to court to secure the rights of others, wielding the ancient writ of habeas corpus that is now being regularly mobilized in the same way in my country in the face of Donald Trump's abuses of the immigration and customs enforcement system. A writ which in some form sort of goes back to Magna Carta, so it's an ancient legal structure. Since the first task of the state after empire was to try to expand welfare provision, his nationalism had the elements you would recognize from standard discussions of philosophical liberalism. The state had to secure order for us, it had to grant and respect equal rights, and it had to guarantee a basic level of education and welfare and healthcare to everyone. So redistributive solidarity was an important part of the picture. The us here was definitely not an ethnic us. For my father's generation, one of the great challenges of independence was to build a united nation that nevertheless recognized and honored our many tribes, as we called them, the various peoples of that the colonial state had brought together. Our diverse languages and cultural and political traditions produced a nation of enormous, often overlapping, forms of diversity. Like the other states on the Gulf of Guinea, we had many Muslims in the north and a great diversity of Christians all over, reflecting the different missionary adventures of the region. But there was a long-established Muslim population in Kumasi, my hometown, which is not in the north of the country. So the idea that Muslims are all in the north and Christians in the south is not right. That's not right. It's not right in Nigeria either, which is often thought of as having a Muslim north and a Christian south. A third of Yoruba people are Muslims in the southwest. But still, there's the really dominant Muslim areas are in the Sahel and in the north. I mean, overwhelmingly Muslim. But Catholicism and Protestantisms of various sorts and Islam, Sunni Islam, were not the only religions. There were countless shrines to hundreds of spirits reflecting the many older religious traditions of our country. So we were definitely a nation of many religious traditions as well as ethno-cultural ones. My father deplored what he called tribalism, and what he meant by that was denying your fellow Ghanaians of other tribes the equal treatment by the state that was at the core of his conception of constitutional government. But that didn't stop him being a loyal son of his tribe, of Asante, our ethnic group. The largest group in Ghana, whose king, when I was a child, was a man called Sosei Ajiman Prempeh II, who was my father's uncle. And he, Ajiman Prempeh was the second was succeeded by my uncle, actually, my father's brother-in-law. These attachments meant that his commitments to equality were political, not social. He evinced in my presence no wrong sense of the wrongness of the social hierarchies that went with traditional rule. But that didn't mean he didn't think that all Ghanaians were civic equals. He did. He was also, as he often told us, his children, a citizen of the world, not surprising perhaps, in a man who kept Marcus Aurelius on his bedside table. But that didn't stop his Ghanaian patriotism from being a mortally serious business, as I said. He once wrote a column in the local newspaper, and once he wrote a column whose title was, "Is Ghana Worth Dying For?" echoing the words of Dr. J.B. Dankwa, one of the founding fathers of Ghana, who did die as a political prisoner in Nkrumah's prisons. And my father thought the answer to that question was clearly yes. And in one of the various coups that dotted Ghana's growing up and mine, he almost did die, since he once shared a cell with a friend of his, a former Ghanaian head of state, who was taken out one day and shot. He thought he was going to be next. So, you can be a cosmopolitan and a devoted patriot, a nationalist committed to the people of your state's homeland, while especially devoted to one people within the homeland that is your own in some sense, defined by ancestry and culture and traditions that are different from those of many of your fellow citizens, and you can be because my father was. That's a well-known elementary theorem of modal logic. P implies possibly P. So there are by now, nearly 75 years later on, almost 35 million Ghanaian individuals, but there is also one Ghanaian people who think of themselves through a Ghanaian we, aware of themselves as fellow citizens of this modern state. They cheer for Ghana at the Olympics and the World Cup, where they often do quite well. Nearly 19 million of them, 61% of the eligible voters, participated in an election last year for a new president, replacing, we had a switch of parties. And that was down from nearly 80% in 2020. So there's plenty of evidence that lots of people in Ghana identify with the civic life of the nation. But this should be more surprising than many people seem to take it to be. After all, there clearly was no Ghanaian people when Ghana was made. The components of the new country hadn't just been created by decisions in Europe. Every country around Ghana today was once a French colony, and their national language for politics is French, ours is English. But every one of our borders is crossed by one of the country's older languages. And the new nation was literally compounded of different colonial possessions, which came today at midnight, together at midnight administratively, on the day of independence. The day before, there were 4 legal entities. There were 2 separate crown colonies, the Gold Coast and Ashanti. There was the British Protectorate of the Northern Territories of the Gold Coast, and there were parts of Togoland which became a single nation, and all of this came together as a British Dominion, like Australia, New Zealand, or Canada for a while before we threw off the Queen as our monarch. Now, my father's passion for this Frankenstein's monster of a country, cobbled together from these disparate parts, a passion he shared with so many others, is an instance of a widespread phenomenon in the post-colonial world. Ghana was stitched together into a single fabric by decision makers in London, even as they occasionally consulted the peoples of these various regions on the way. There are more than 80 languages spoken in Ghana today, so Fichte's linguistic criterion of nationality isn't going to do you much good. The only languages Ghanaians have for speaking to each other are 2 former colonial languages, English and my father's language, Tree, which was spread throughout much of the country by the Ashanti Empire, which has replaced the British one, which one replaced at the turn of the 20th century. So my hometown came under British administration in the 20th century. Neither of these languages, English and Tree, defines the ethnic identities of any modern Ghanaian, because dialects of Tree are the home language of many non-Asante Akan Ghanaians who were not part of the Asante Empire. So Brongs, Ahafo, Fantis, Kwahus, Akims, Akwapims, Waso, Gwangs, and Cherepon, just to give you their names, they all speak this language, but they were not all ever under one system of rule until Ghana. And as I've already observed, we are no more united in religion than we are in language. Nigeria, 2 countries to the east, and much larger, with nearly 250 million people, has hundreds of languages, thousands of traditional rulers, a great diversity of religious traditions, including, as Ghana does, Catholicism, many Protestantisms, and Sunni Islam. And yet in Nigeria, too, there is a national we. I was in Lagos recently. It's very evident that there's this new thing, and the people who participate in this are not all from, where you happen to be. They're not all from Lagos. And so, as with Daniel Defoe's true-born Englishmen, the actual diversity of their origins is neither here nor there. Defoe, you'll recall, wrote in 1701, this is the ethno-linguistic diversity of Nigeria, Defoe wrote in 1701, "The Scot, Pict, Briton, Roman, Dane submit, and with the English Saxon all unite. Fate jumbled them together, God knows how, whate'er they were, they're true-born English now." And you could do a Ghanaian version, or a Nigerian version, or a Kenyan version, or a Zimbabwean version, or a South African version of that. Mutatis, as they say, mutandis. To recap, I've been assembling reminders of the diversity of ways in which states rely on and help to create and shape a people and a sense of a national we. It's stories like these that make me doubt the thought that a Fichtian people united in their maternal tongues and the cultural traditions sustained by a spirit of their language is necessary for the creation of a national identity. Many of Fichte's German-speaking contemporaries, especially the many ones who didn't read or write, surely had no encompassing sense of the Deutsche Nation. They didn't think of themselves. It wouldn't have occurred to them. And they wouldn't have known where the Deutsche Nation was, and they certainly wouldn't have known that it included Sweden. So Pache the Grimms, the stories they collected were not universally known in the German-speaking lands. Many of them were not even especially German, having roots, some of them, as far back as India. Some of them are Indo-European folk tales that ended up in Germany, but they ended up everywhere else as well. So turning German speakers into a German people with a national we was the work of 19th century politics. And what the story of Ghana tells us is this: precisely because a modern state, even a poor one, does so much in the lives of its population, once that state is in place, its centrality in the lives of its citizens guarantees that they can come to think of themselves as a people without losing the local particularities of ethnicity or religion or maternal language. But it's also important that the story of the formation of modern nations, so many of which have boundaries created since 1945, runs alongside a modern story of massive migration and mixture. The countries of sub-Saharan Africa are internally ethnically diverse, not only as the result of the assembling of disparate people into territories by empires, but also because people move. Africans cross African borders. More than 2 million Nigerians live in Ghana. But people from the Levant, people whose descendants are Syrian and Lebanese, and people from India whose descendants are Indian citizens of Gujarat or the Punjab, settled in Africa and also in Latin America and the Caribbean over the 20th century. There's currently a significant Chinese migration going on into many African countries. In Europe, as everyone knows, the empire struck back, bringing Surinamese and Indonesians to Amsterdam, Africans and Indians to London, Senegalese and Algerians to Paris. Germany may have lost its African empire in 1918, but there are 40,000 people of Ghanaian ancestry in Germany, a quarter of them in the area around Hamburg, and over 1 million Germans are of African descent. In these circumstances, defining the nation in ancestral terms is going to divide the citizenry, not unite it. Religion is a troubling basis for defining national identity as well. Less than 3/4 of Israelis are Jewish, even though in 2018 the state enshrined in its quasi-constitutional basic laws its status as the national home of the Jewish people. Pakistan is constitutionally an Islamic republic, but at least 10% of its Muslims are Shia, not Sunni. A few are Ahmadiyya, and the government doesn't even recognize them as Muslims. It's illegal for an Ahmadiyya Pakistani to say that they're a Muslim, even though they think they're Muslims. And of course, there are 3 or 4% of the population of Pakistan are Hindus, Christians, Sikhs, and Zoroastrians, and so on. And increasingly, of course, there are Pakistanis who don't practice any religion at all, as there are in almost every country in the world. What other bases are there for creating a sense of national solidarity? One obvious one, defined long ago, as I said, by Aristotle, is an attachment to the basic constitution, whether conceived of, as in the French and Americans' case, as a written document, or as in the British case, as a complex shared understanding about the system of political rule. The trouble with this idea is that it seems very abstract too thin to create a real sense of national solidarity. What's richer and perhaps more likely to work is the sort of national story that was told in those national education systems I mentioned earlier, an investment in the history of the state and its achievements. Even in new states like Ghana and Armenia, the Republic of Armenia, there are stories to be told about the foundations of the modern state, stories that can lead, of course, backwards into earlier histories of all other kinds of institutions, including other states. Ghana, after all, is named for a medieval kingdom of the Sahel, the Empire of Ghana. Armenian religious and literary traditions go back a very long way, as you all know. And now, as Leonie Hadi and Alessandro Del Ponte have argued, a sense of national identity can have very different political effects if it's a matter of, feelings of warmth for the nation, a kind of warm glow when you think of Armenia or the United States. Hard to have a warm glow thinking of the United States today, but I try. Celebrating national culture and achievements, also possible here and in the United States, or, as is also possible but less attractive, conceiving of one's nation as superior to others, thinking of the greatness of Great Britain. National identity, as closeness, or as pride, or as chauvinism in their terms, have different political effects. But pride in a shared history can work positively so long as it's not conflated with the definition of the people solely in terms of ancestry or religion. And my sense of my country, the United States of America, as having a history for which parts of which I can feel pride and other parts of which I can feel shame, doesn't depend on my having any American ancestors, which I don't. Another familiar possibility, favored in France, is a more explicitly high cultural national identification. Much modern study of high culture, literary studies and art history and musicology, is well adapted to this end. Hippolyte Taine's monumental Histoire de la littérature anglaise, published in France in the 1860s, which is the first modern literary history of English, so it's wonderful that it was written by a Frenchman, begins with the words, "History has been transformed within 100 years in Germany, within 60 in France, and that by the study of their literatures." Matthew Arnold's Culture and Anarchy, published around the same time, sees the literature of Britain as as the national expression of the nature of its constituent peoples, the Celts, the Anglo-Saxons. And as this example suggests, you can celebrate the cultural products of the state's constituent peoples in a nationalism that takes pride in the variety of literatures and arts produced in these borders rather than in their uniformity or their oneness. This cultural route has its own risks, however. What is best in Arnoldian culture cuts across race and nation and time and place. One of Goethe's great poetical achievements is the Vestovsky Divan, inspired by the poetry of a 14th century Persian Hafiz, whose tomb in Shiraz is still a place of cultural pilgrimage for Iranians. Divan is the Persian word for a collection of poetry, so Goethe's title, West Eastern Poetry Collection, is explicitly meant to bridge the gap. Similarly, Matsuo Basho, the magnificent haiku master of the 17th century, was shaped to a significant degree by Zen Buddhism. So the Buddha, not a Japanese person, is part of Basho's heritage, part of his cultural material. He also used the Chinese script, of course. Kurosawa's Throne of Blood, great movie. It's dark, cinematic. Its dark castle walls on Mount Fuji, swathed in mist, is a powerful cinematic rendering of Macbeth, which is an Englishman's play about a Scotsman. The trick, then, is to bind the people together through a love of literature and the arts that's nevertheless open to the inevitable cosmopolitanism of serious aesthetic life. This high cultural way of thinking about the nation, which is in any case I think it's a view of national identity that's most likely to seem attractive to a professor. Understanding and following popular sports like soccer and basketball and baseball and rugby seems like a better candidate for the creation of a less intellectually demanding form of solidarity. But all these proposals share an assumption, the sort of assumption that it's the work of philosophy to ferret out and question. I've spoken of a national we, which implies, of course, a sense of identification. The identification with a state is with a state and what I'm calling its people. But it occurs by way of a name, a label, America, Armenia, Ghana, and people can use the same label without giving it the same significance. We can have one identity as Danes or Americans or Ghanaians or Armenians with many different conceptions of it. People can disagree, indeed, about who exactly counts as Danish or Armenian, without that meaning that they're not talking about the same thing. They're not just talking past each other, they're having a debate, which is important for them. And the fact that the contest is over the same label and roughly the same territory is enough, other things being equal, to mean that they are talking about the same thing. And that means that elements of religion, language, and arts and letters, both popular and elite, can all play a role, so long as we bear in mind the dangers associated with overvaluing any of them, and that's because they can all play a role because they'll be playing a different role for different people. Not everybody has to have the same conception of them. There's scope, in other words, for political struggles based in conflicting understandings of the nation, so that has to be managed. But we should remember that, as in Rwanda, a common language and a shared history and a shared religion provides no guarantee of national solidarity. Diverse understandings of the nation are, in fact, the normal case. Knowing that lots of people identify as Canadian doesn't tell you how they settle who is a Canadian, or fix what their being Canadian means to them, or what they think it should mean for others. Modern understandings of each nationality, in other words, are irreducibly plural. As a result, the rationales for solidarity that national identification produces are also plural. As a Dane, for example, all these consequences of feeling close to the Danish nation are possible. Identifying with a strong social welfare tradition and supporting extensive social welfare for all citizens, while not having much sympathy or respect for those, especially those of recent foreign ancestry, who actually need it. Or two, identifying with the nation and thus feeling sympathy for fellow nationals, and so supporting extensive social welfare provision for real Danes, but not so much for others. Or three, identifying with the nation as a result of believing that most others do as well, and supporting social welfare as part of a scheme of fair cooperation, which includes all who share the identification and commitment, whatever their ancestry. Or identifying with the nation's proud Christian heritage, and so regarding non-Christians as outside the sphere of sympathy and concern. I'm not identifying these as any particular person. I'm saying these are all possible views, possible ways of thinking about Danishness. Dunksheet. Is that how you say it? And this list could be extended. So, working out the details of the social psychology in operation in each society requires doing experiments and surveys, which is what's done in much of the political psychology of nationalism today and the sociology of nationalism today. But the empirical reality is that it's possible to bring people together through national symbols that generate a sense of solidarity without requiring a national consensus on what the symbols mean. You can be one people while not giving your national identity one meaning. Of course, for the purposes of government, citizens need to have a language or two in common. There are exceptions, but they don't undermine the point. South Africa's 12 official languages, Afrikaans, English, isiNdebele, isiXhosa, isiZulu, Sepedi, Sesotho, Setswana, Siswati, Tshivenda, Tsonga, and South African Sign Language, they wouldn't work if the first two weren't understood, English and Afrikaans, weren't understood by almost everybody. Switzerland's official languages, French and German, Italian, and in case you've forgotten, Romansh, reflect the way in which that country's patriotism works largely through deep loyalties to the cantons of a relatively loose confederation. 3 of Singapore's 4 official languages, Chinese, Malay, and Tamil, work alongside English, which is taught in the state schools to everyone. So you get to choose which other language you learn, but everybody has to learn English. In developing a national education, a state has to decide which dialects of which language should be taught, at least as a written language. And it's nice, too, if the history taught in the schools explains how and why these people were gathered into this place. And government, concerned to get citizens acting and feeling together, would like a story that connects them with each other, a story that doesn't give hostages to fortune by being too far from the truth. With a diverse population, filigreed with potentially divisive local histories and traditions, it might be necessary to glide over conflictual claims on the truth, however. Ernest Renan, who was also mentioned this morning, the conservative French historian and patriot, declared in 1882, forgetting, and I would even say historical error, is an essential element in the creation of a nation. And part of what he had in mind was the need for the French to forget the persecution of the Huguenots and the post-revolutionary terror and the slaughter that followed in the so-called massacres in the Vendée. But as Renan also argued, what really matters in making a modern nation beyond these shared stories is what he called the clear expressed desire to continue a common life. That's why he said that a nation's existence is, I'm quoting, if you will pardon the metaphor, a daily plebiscite, a daily vote. What makes us a people, ultimately, looks not backwards, but forwards. It's a commitment to governing a common life together. In building modern national solidarities, I don't think we should make the argument in terms of some ancient spirits of the language of the folk, the Volksgeist or the Sprachgeist. The truth of every modern nation is that political unity is never underwritten by some pre-existing national commonality. What binds citizens together is a commitment, through Renan's daily plebiscite, to sharing the life of a modern state, united by its institutions, procedures, and precepts. Each country has to take the tools available through its own particular history to fashion, out of its many constituent identities, a single national we. A people is not something that can be taken for granted. It has to be made and remade through politics and in everyday social life. Thank you.